Okay, so let's look at what could shift the demand for resource curve to the left or to the right. Now, hopefully, as you've thought about your career research paper and the things you've learned from it, you also want to be looking for current events and things that indicate that the demand for the resource that you'll be, whether it's in marketing or engineering or whatever it happens to be, indicates that it likely will have a rightward shift in the resource demand curve. So we want to look at what are the things that can cause that to happen. So those determinants of MRP, the first of them is looking at what is happening to resource productivity. And as a FYI, consider your resume that you might have and the words that are used in that resume. Does it prove productivity along with the experience? And sometimes just putting a little more detail or emphasizing what kind of productivity you've had in different jobs will improve your resumes, because that's, remember that economics looks at choices that are made, decision making. And one of the things that helps to determine a choice of a worker is how productivity or how productive they are. So what are the things that change resource productivity? Well, one, we can look at attitude, risk, health, general abilities, and that's not only natural abilities, but abilities you gain through training and education. Also consider some of those robot-proof skill sets that I mentioned at the beginning of the semester. Those soft skills, systems thinking, creativity, application of research, and critical thinking. And recall again from the beginning of this semester, LinkedIn's most demanded skills that included a lot of the aspects of this course as well. All of these things can potentially change resource productivity. Also, another thing that changes resource productivity is a change in the quantity or the quality of complementary resources. So, for example, let's say you get a law degree and you're working with improved robotics and software that help you research previous cases that occurred in law. Well, that might make you more productive as a lawyer because you have this complementary robotics, artificial intelligence type resource that's helping you become a better lawyer. And so that also ties in with technological advance. Businesses tend to adopt technologies that allow them to become more productive. So when combined with workers, so think about the Tesla manufacturing plant. You have a handful of workers, but they're working with very productive robotics. So for those individual workers, with every new and improved robotic that comes along and produces faster and better quality automobiles, then your resource productivity is rising. So resource productivity is one of the big determinants of MRP. The second thing that can change resource MRP is a change in the price of a substitute resource. So for example, replacing those units of labor with robots. Now there's two impacts, since we'd want to look at the net impact of the two effects. One is the substitution effect, and this is if a robot is viewed as a better choice than labor, and so you lose your job because of a robot, then that is the substitution effect. You've been substituted. But if, because the firm has adopted lots of robots, they can afford to build a bigger factory than they would otherwise have. And that requires, with those robots, that they hire more workers. So you get the job because of that growth, because that increase in output, then that is the output effect. So both effects are in place in the case of technology and humans. So we want to see which is the bigger one. So that's the second thing that is on the list of determinants. The third is the change in the price of a complementary resource. So for example, computers with labor. In general, if the price of computers drops, then perhaps more labor can be hired. And so the demand for that resource goes up. And then lastly, we want to look at the change in demand for the end good or service. So this example of determinant I gave you at the beginning of the first video, where we talked about how due to the pandemic and the decrease in demand for travel, there's been a big decrease in demand for pilots. So it's looking at that end service. So again, looking at the determinants of MRP, the things that can shift the resource demand curve. To the left is a decrease, to the right is an increase. So things you want to be looking for evidence of in your resumes. Can you show an increase in productivity? And but other things that could influence and change the demand for you is what is happening to the price of substitute resources that you could be substituted by. And again, we looked at that likelihood in the career paper. So maybe and hopefully there's a low chance that you'll be substituted. So you won't have to deal with this determinant at all, but it's possible it could happen in your future. Also, a change in the price of a complementary resource. So what are the things that you could be combined with? What are happening with those prices in the world around you? And then also, what would you predict in terms of demand for the end good or service that you might become part of with your career? So each of these things are important determinants of MRP, and again, shift the demand for resources either to the right as an increase or to the left as a decrease. Now, another thing for you to think about is elasticity. How elastic will the demand curve for you as a resource be? So we use price elasticity of demand calculations specific to resource pricing. So you want to reflect back on that price elasticity of demand calculation. And remember that you can use the midpoint formula, percentage change formula, but essentially if we use percentage change, for example, you look at the percentage change in quantity, you divide it by the percentage change in price to determine whether between any two prices for you as a resource or any two wages, whether you're elastic, inelastic, or unit elastic. So remember, elastic, it'll solve as greater than 1. Inelastic will solve as less than 1, but greater than 0 because we absolute value. Inelastic is equal to 1. So there are three main determinants that will determine if the demand for you as a resource is inelastic, like a heroin addict, where they'll pay any price for you, or whether it's elastic, like a carrot consumer, meaning that they're very willing to walk away from acquiring you as a worker if there's any change in price. In other words, any change in your wage. So one thing you'd want to look at to determine if the career you're going into is going to be inelastic or elastic is you want to look at and estimate the elasticity of the end product or service. So for example, gasoline is a very inelastic demand curve. So petroleum engineers likely have a very inelastic demand for resource curve, willing to pay a much higher price for a petroleum engineer. If, however, you are someone who works in the fields and you are harvesting carrots have a very elastic demand. So therefore, workers have a very elastic demand curve. So they're not likely to have much pricing power in terms of demanding a higher wage. So we want to look at the elasticity of the end product or service. The other thing that can influence elasticity of resource demand is what is the resource, you as a worker, you as a resource, what is your cost as a percentage of overall production costs? So if we think about extracting oil out of the earth and refining it and turning it into gasoline, as a petroleum engineer, you're actually a very small percentage of the overall costs for extracting oil and getting into a gasoline form. So because you are a small part of the overall cost, you as a petroleum engineer would have a very inelastic demand curve influenced by this. The last thing that would influence the elasticity or inelasticity of you as a resource is how many substitutes there are for you. So when we think about what is the most popular undergraduate degree in the United States, I believe it's still psychology. And so you don't tend to see bachelor's degrees in psychology paying much because there are a lot of substitutes to you. And in general, you need a much higher level degree in psychology in order to have a significant increase in your wage. Why? Because there's a lot fewer individuals with a PhD in psychology compared to a bachelor's degree. And again, if we look at petroleum engineering as one of the highest paid, if not the, I think it is still the highest paid undergraduate degree, is because there aren't a lot of individuals graduating with a petroleum degree engineer. They're a small part of overall costs, and the end product of what they are part of producing is also very inelastic. So overall, we can predict that petroleum engineers have a very inelastic demand curve, and therefore, ultimately, firms are willing to pay a very high price in order to have them work for them. So we want to look again at not only what the determinants that cause demand to shift left and right for resources, but also what their elasticity might look like. So here's a question for you. If the elasticity of product demand is 0.5 in industry A and is 3.2 in industry B, ceteris paribus, will labor demand be more elastic in industry A or in B? And your answer should be, it's going to be more elastic in B because B's end product elasticity is 3.2, which is elastic. And so therefore the resources that produce industry B products are also going to be more elastic. Okay, so there's one more thing for us to look at with this theory. And that's cost minimization, but we'll get to that in the next video.